Thank you very much for having me, and good afternoon, everybody. I hope that you're enjoying this important Congress over these 2 days, and we're honoured to be here joining with yourselves in helping tackle the issue of the climate crisis. I'm going to speak a little bit about what is happening in Australia, particularly looking at the policy around accelerating the decarbonisation of our electricity system and also the transition challenges that we're facing, and to talk about some of the areas which I think that we can work together to accelerate the decarbonisation further. I thought I'd just start off with this slide regarding Australia, and many of you, or all of you, would have heard about the Black Summer bushfires of late 2019, early 2020, which ravaged Australia and were seen from the moon, as you can see from this satellite photo. Importantly, we were lucky on this particular set of fires that we didn't have a large number of deaths of humans, as we had back in 2009 with the Black Saturday bushfires, which we had 173 people lost their lives as a direct result. But the point that I'm making with this slide is that we had 3 billion animals which were either killed or displaced from their habitats as a result of these fires. Australia unfortunately has a very large number of species which are under threat of extinction, and some would say that we actually, because of the diversity of the biodiversity of our country, we are very vulnerable to losing lots of species. And I've actually put up 2 of the species there, which is the gang cockatoo and the koala that Australia is very well known from. The reason for me putting these 2 particular ones up is because we have recently updated our State of the Environment report earlier this year, and these 2 species were added to the threatened species list in Australia. And the bushfires are part of the direct result of that, as well as the other issue of droughts and deforestation within our country. One of the important aspects of that State of the Environment report, which we just had in Australia come out in the last couple of months, and they're done every 5 years. So the State of the Environment report that preceded it was in 2016, and it is fascinating to read both those reports. And in 2016, they talked about the impact of climate change was something of grave concern, but they talked about it as being something down the track, not something that we were facing now in terms of what we're seeing in 2022. And the 2022 report is has a chronology of many examples of where climate change is hurting Australia extremely bad currently. And we had the Black Summer bushfires, we had a severe drought. We're actually fortunate to have some rains that I'll talk about further shortly. But we also had some extreme floods, as you might have also heard about. And I know that our colleagues in the other room are looking at this issue very closely. That in the Lismore floods, as they're called, in New South Wales and Queensland, we had a 1 in 1,000-year flood event. And then a few months later, we had another 1 in 1,000-year flood event. So certainly this is examples of the impacts of climate change biting and making severe impacts, which is why this conference and the work that we're all doing in this space is just so important. Some of the good news. Australia has the best solar resource in the world. If you have a solar panel in Australia and you have a solar panel in Germany, Australian solar panel will generate about 2.6 times the amount of energy. This is a terrific slide because one of the other big advantages of Australia is lots of land which is available for harnessing this solar resource. The small circle in this slide is the amount of area we would need to cover Australia with solar panels to be able to meet Australia's energy demand. The bigger circle is the amount that we would need to meet the global energy demand. Fantastic opportunity. We just need to make this happen. Another really important fact about Australia that we have we do have the highest penetration rate of solar panels on rooftops of anywhere in the world. We've put 60 million panels on roofs in the last 10 years. And we've now got about 30% of renewable generation as part of our electricity system. Now, I was meeting with some colleagues in India recently, and they said, without a carbon tax, because you may also know that Australia is the only country in the world to have had a carbon price and then to taken it away, which was a terribly bad move in my view. But how do we get such great penetration of solar in particular, and also wind power? And what were the policy levers or the elements to make that happen? And there was really, I think, four major reasons. The first one you'd all very well be well aware of is the significant drop in the cost of solar. Started to make it a payback period that just made good economic sense to everybody, whether they were worried about the climate or not. We had a government about 20 years ago, the federal government, bring in the renewable energy target, which basically put an obligation on all the retailers in the country that were selling power to purchase or to create a certain amount of renewable energy as part of that. Started off very low at about 2%. It steadily increased over the next 20 years. I argue that that has been the most positive climate policy that Australia's put in, and is the reason why we've now, I'm able to say, we've got 30% renewable energy in our system at least. The other thing which we saw happen was the state governments. So rather than the federal government, the state governments taking leadership action to drive particularly large-scale renewable energy, solar and wind farms. This was largely done by setting targets at a state level and then having auctions, and what we call contracts for difference. So basically the government would provide the certainty to the investors to make the investment for that 15 or 25 years to get these projects up. One of the fascinating points between the first auction that we ran in Victoria in about 2014, and we ran one again in about 2017. In 2014, the wind farm projects would easily win the auctions as the lowest cost of power in Australia. And we're actually concerned about that, particularly in places that I live towards the south of Australia, that the solar wasn't being invested in. So we were having a carve out for solar, a part of the auction, which would say we'll have technology neutral for most of it, has to be whatever is the least cost, and we'll have a special amount for solar. By the latest auction, solar was winning all the auctions because, again, that dramatic shift in the amount of solar that's come out. Why Australia? And I've mentioned some of these points, but this is just putting it in a relative comparison. And I think the key things I'd like you to focus on in this slide is that cost of solar, which you'll see is one of the lowest in the world, that cost of onshore wind, which is one of the lowest in the world, but importantly is that cost of offshore wind is also one of the best in the world. Australia doesn't currently have any offshore wind farms. Again, you could argue lots of that land availability and not a need to have offshore wind farms. However, getting back to those cost profiles I was talking about before, because we can now make offshore wind farms so large and the cost profiles come down so far, we are now seeing a rush, I would say, of building offshore wind farms, particularly, again, down in the part of the world that I live in, which is in Victoria, in the southeast coast, where we have what we call the roaring 40s winds, which come off the Arctic Ocean. So the next question in the policy development sense is, how is this going to play out? What is going to happen as we transition our economy to net zero by 2050? And in particular, what is the role of hydrogen or electricity exports as part of this system? To acknowledge and commend your Prime Minister Modi with the initiative of One Sun, One World, One Grid, I think he is absolutely correct. We need to be thinking as the globe, as one energy system and one connected grid. And we need to be focused on solving these problems together, not being parochial about it. The first bit of research that we did back in 2019 was looking at HDVC cables, so high voltage direct current cables under the sea, to places such as Indonesia and Singapore. And was really looking at the ability of using the complementarity of those two countries' energy supply and demand mix to make the economic case that it made sense to actually connect these two countries' grids. The one to Indonesia is not currently going ahead, but we do currently have a cable which is being built from Darwin in the Northern Territory part of Australia to Singapore by Sun Cable. Mike Cannon-Brooks is one of the people you might know of as well in that space. And that will supply 15% of Singapore's energy from essentially huge solar resources in the middle of Australia. The other thing that happened during this period was, I think, the hydrogen industry saying what's going to be needed, and clearly our potential trading partners, Germany is one of those that we do a lot of work with, were saying we want green hydrogen, renewable hydrogen, not made from fossil fuels, because we want to meet our obligations, particularly to the EU and to the climate. And then the issue of ammonia is now by far the most likely, what we consider the first mover of how hydrogen will be exported to other countries. And that's likely to be other countries. Initially, we would think will be Germany, but also Japan, Singapore, South Korea are places where we think the first exports will happen. And particularly that it'll happen from these large hubs around the country, probably about 5 or 6 very large hubs, very big plants in the order of at least 10 gigawatts, and some are even talking, well, the Asian Renewable Energy Hub I mentioned before is talking about 25 gigawatts, and there's people in an Indian companies talking about a 100 gigawatt plant. Very large scale. The most reason why we expect that will happen at these large scale in these hubs is because of the cost profile of making high hydrogen from electrolysis. The biggest cost is the cost of energy, and as I mentioned before, that's dropped by an order of magnitude over this past 10 years. It's why people are suddenly talking about this as a viable option. But the next biggest cost is the cost of the electrolyzers, which we had one of the colleagues previously talk about being very expensive at the moment. And in fact, since the Ukraine crisis, they've actually gone up about 3-fold, and actually hard to get anywhere in the world. But because you've got these large capital costs of these projects, you have to run them continuously so that the investors get their return on the investment. So you want to run them 24/7, not turn them off and on, basically. However, as we expect the cost of electrolyzers will come down, same as what we saw the cost of solar panels come down, we're seeing the cost of batteries, lithium-ion batteries come down. We will see the cost of electrolyzers come down too. And then what we've modelled here is we expect it will be much more dispersed production of hydrogen across the grid as we would see it. And one of the advantages then particularly is you can turn it off when you want to, put it on when you want to. When the sun is shining, all the demand is there. And so that's what helps the cost profile particularly. The next question, which we're currently looking at and that I'll be able to talk about in future things, is the seasonal complementarity between the southern hemisphere and the northern hemisphere in production of hydrogen. Essentially, the large demands, particularly in Europe, of the Boreal summer versus when we've got summer in the southern hemisphere, there's a beautiful complementarity in terms of how you size these plants, and to have agreements that take into account that complementarity so we can size them and get a better overall cost profile. What else is happening in Australia and what are governments doing in a policy sense? One of the questions I often get, particularly from many companies in India, and I'm over here in a delegation with the Smart Energy Council, and Mr. John Grimes received an award yesterday, which he was very privileged and honoured to get here. We're here to really look at the supply chains of being able to meet our increasing energy growth in renewables. Currently, Australia gets about 95% of all its solar panels, all its batteries I talked about before, from one country. And that is a vulnerability that we don't want to have going into the future. We are seeing India as the perfect partner to be able to supply the sorts of scale that we're talking about that Australia is going to need, both in meeting its own decarbonisation levels, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute, as well as become this exporting hydrogen superpower, along with India wanting to do that as well. And I think there's complementarity working together there. This is in South Australia, the South Australian Hydrogen Jobs Plan. They are putting, as part of their recent election commitment of this government, to build a 250 megawatt electrolyser in South Australia by 2025. Very ambitious, very exciting. Importantly, they're putting $600 million on the table. So they're serious about making this happen. And that's the government, also wanting private sector investment. But just thinking about that for a minute, we've the biggest electrolyser in Australia at the moment is about 1.5 megawatts. I'm working on a green ammonia plant with Yara in the Pilbara, which we were talking about before. That's a 10 megawatt electrolyser plant to produce green ammonia. Still one of the biggest industrial scale electrolysers in the world, but very small in the scheme of things. And this just gives you about a sense of the ambition and what's going to be needed. We don't currently make any electrolysers here in Australia, or in Australia, it's not here in Australia, sorry. We don't currently make any electrolysers here, and we're going to need to if we're going to be able to meet those demands that are going to be created by these massive projects that I'm talking about. So again, the reason we're here is to see, are there partners in India that can help us deliver these important components of decarbonisation. Almost at my last slide. I hope I'm okay for time still. So the next question, which I think is really worthwhile just focusing on for a minute, is the transition story. I grew up in a coal town of brown coal mines. There's many, many towns and places in Australia and around the world that are quickly seeing the closure of coal plants, and there will be similarly steel plants and other plants that are based on fossil fuels. It's going to have to happen, and it is inevitable. Not only because the governments are going to make it happen to meet their commitments, but also because the cost just doesn't stack up anymore. The cheapest form of power is from solar and wind, as I was talking about before. But what I'm really concerned about is how those towns and communities transition, and we don't have mass dislocation of people and jobs and the social impacts that go with that, particularly in places like Latrobe Valley, which is where I was born, in the Hunter Valley in New South Wales, in Port Kembla, Illawarra, in places like Whyalla, which was one I talked about just previously. So this is really looking at, this is a piece of work I'm actually working on with another area in Australia called Lithgow, that you may not have heard about, but it's in the Blue Mountains. It's another coal town, actually exports a lot of coal, and that town is currently looking at a rapid change in its being based on coal and wants to go to a renewables-led economy. So this is essentially looking at three concepts for how that might happen, because everyone says, oh, well, we'll just go to green steel, or well, that doesn't happen in an instant, particularly when you talk about local economies. So this is basically looking at three different scenarios about how they might build the capacity and the capability to transition. And the first one is to put in solar. It's not the best place in Australia for solar, but so there's other areas which might be more preferable. They've got better geography or whatever. But having that solar as basis, not just for the immediate benefits you get of helping the grid, but as the primer to other things, particularly in terms of also connecting it with storage, which we've got a great demand and need in Australia for urgently more storage. As my learned colleague was talking about before, this rapid shift to renewables is putting extreme pressure on our electricity grid, and we urgently need much more storage to have firm power. And then moving up to having a green hydrogen electrolysis, and then using that for other things such as fertiliser and metals and advanced manufacturing. The next one's focusing on a different slight aspect of that, of looking at the potential for green hydrogen to be a zero carbon power fuel, to be able to power, particularly we think, long haul trucks, buses, trains and ships going forward. But using that as really the impetus to get that initial off-take happening. That's what we're trying to do in that particular scenario. And then that's then focused much more on the automotive sector. So Australia traditionally had a big automotive sector. We used to make a lot of cars. We don't anymore because the world changed. But importantly, India is very much part of that story. Lots of the businesses here, and I'm going to one this afternoon, Motherson, which is one of our platinum member companies, is a major supplier of components in the automotive sector. And they traditionally were supplying the rear vision mirrors for cars and trucks and those sorts of things. But they're currently, their corporate office here has given them direction to diversify. And so what they're looking at for as an automotive company, diversifying into renewables. They're looking at manufacturing inverters in Adelaide, where I was talking about before, and they're also looking at high hydrogen and potentially electrolysis in particular. The last one is the energy from waste, as we would like to call it. Australia and the world still has a huge waste problem, and we need to be able to deal with that if we're going to address and live in a safe world. So how can we use the energy, the waste supply chains? And in the past, Australia had a lot of landfills, again, a lot of space, a lot of landfills to be able to put stuff. That's diminishing and not the best option, to be frank. So we're looking at, well, whether waste to energy plants or waste from energy, as we would prefer to call about it, is an option for where we go in that particular area. And in pumped hydro is another area. This particular part of the world it's in the Blue Mountains. So there's lots of very nice peaks and troughs where you can have a lake at the bottom and a turkey nest dam at the top of the mountain, and you can have a nice pumped hydro system. And also, not so much coal mines in this area, but traditionally, particularly gold mines, which are much more stable and for other reasons, are very good for pumped hydro in particular. Australian government policy, critically important to this story, and the shift that's happened in Australia in the past few months is nothing more than dramatic. We have got a government that wants to take action, is taking action, and is being ambitious. That 43% emissions reduction is now being put into law. We've signed it up as our commitment to under the UNFCCC. But what that means, though, is 82% renewables in our grid by 2030. And if you recall what I started off saying, we had about 30-odd% in our grid. Again, we need to see that 3- to 4-fold shift in the amount of energy. That's just to meet our own energy needs and our own decarbonisation needs. That's not all the hydrogen needs and all those other needs. The government is making serious investment. It's investing $3 billion as part of its National Reconstruction Fund. And a lot of these things we've actually focused on, and we've got a bilateral agreement with India to look specifically at these issues going forward. And there's the clean energy ministers that will be hosted here next year. We're hoping to be back with not just myself, but some of my other industry colleagues and businesses as part of that. 20 billion rewiring Australia. Just want to mention that for a minute. That will roll out. We expect about 10,000 kilometres of transmission lines. Largely the reason that is that all the transmission infrastructure was built around these coal-fired power plants that I was talking about and delivering from them to the demand centres. They're not the optimal places for wind and solar power. So we've got these energy-rich regions that we call renewable energy zones that are being developed, and that's about sharing those infrastructure costs, things like the synchronous condensers, the other ancillary services, as part of that to deliver that very low, not quite zero cost power, but from these regions or these zones to the demand centres. In conclusion, one of my other areas is to look in water, and Dr. Anil was speaking before about the water conference upstairs. And I think my point is that we need to also much more not just look at the world through an energy lens or look at the world through a water lens or a waste lens. We need to be looking at the world through an interconnected system and what I call the energy, waste and water nexus. This book is actually about the water markets that we have in Australia. One of the driest, well, it is the driest inhabited continent on Earth. Very, very vulnerable to droughts, and our water markets need to operate effectively. It's a tragedy, so if you're not up for a sad story, I suggest you don't read this book. But essentially says don't build markets or water markets like we have, where they can be open to profiteering, market manipulation, insider trading, and all the things which we don't want to see in a well-functioning market. Thank you very much, and I look forward to seeing you again.